You may have heard of the Esp8266 or the Nodemcu. It's a very useful microcontroller you can buy cheaply from China for about $3 if you're buying from China, or $7 or $8 if you're buying from the US with much faster shipping. This comes in several different configurations, but the two most useful I have here. Firstly, you have the Nodemcu board, which is a full development board. It has, this will focus. It has the USB serial adapter right here, and then the chip itself is soldered onto a board, and all the pins are broken out. And it won't focus quite exactly correctly, but there we go. All of the pins are labeled very nicely right there. So this is a very good board. You can buy it from China. It's called the Nodemcu board. You might need to be careful about which regulator you get. If you're running on a Mac, this is the CH340G, which I'll write that down real quick. The CH340G USB to serial regulator, and that works well if you're on Windows or Linux, but the driver is a little bit tricky to install on a Mac. It's doable, but it's a little bit trickier. The easier one to do is the CP2102. That's CP2102, and I think it's even a little bit cheaper from most sellers. But if you are a do-it-yourselfer and feel like wiring a bunch of pins, you can get this one, which is the chip that you saw previously on that board, but all by itself. So this is the ESP12, and it's also a very useful chip. It's the same chip that you saw on the other board. I'll hold them side by side for comparison. But with this board, you have to solder the pins yourself. Each of the pins has a through-plated hole, and also there's metal on the edge that you could solder to. But I found that with simple wire like this, the edge of the wire, if you cut it, the edge of the wire will just go, if you strip it, will just go right into that hole, and soldering it was pretty easy. There's a few things to notice with this. I'll put a link in the description for what pins to put together, but there's several pins that you have to tie to plus and ground in order to make the device boot successfully, which can hold people up when they're just getting started, which is another reason to try this board out, because everything is already set up. In order to program this board, however, you will need something like this. This is a USB to serial adapter. This one happens to use this CH340G because it's a really cheap board from China, but you can find other ones including FTDI, although I don't usually recommend them. Prolific, I think, has one, and then there's the CP2102. So the important thing to note here is that it has to have a 3.3 volt mode. This jumper here lets you switch between 3.3 and 5 volt modes. That's important because this is designed to take 3 to 3.6 volts, I believe. Another thing you might run into with these chips is power consumption. Sometimes when they turn on, they spike up to 200 milliamps, and not all of these USB power supplies USB serial converters can provide that amount of current right off the bat. So it's best either to provide a separate power supply, in which case you would just tie ground so that you have a common ground through the whole system. The ground pin here, which is this one, it won't focus, but the ground pin is this one, and it's clearly labeled. You'd want to tie that to the ground rail on your solderless breadboard or whatever else you happen to be using. That way the signals will work correctly. And then, of course, when you're working with serial ports, RXD and TXD on this device, This is receive for the USB device and transmit for the USB device, so you want to connect receive to transmit and transmit to receive. I'll just draw that here. You have the ESP board, and I'll draw the little squiggly antenna. And then the UART pins are I believe these two right here. So this would be TX and this would be RX. And so from the USB, if this is TX and this is RX, you want to connect RX to TX and RX to TX. And then one pin of this will be ground, and you definitely need to connect that to the, the ground coming off of here, so that they are all tied together. And then even if you don't connect the plus from this to the plus on here, you can power this externally, but then it will all work. Anyway, more videos to come, and if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments. This is a really useful microcontroller. You can do a lot with it. The Lua firmware that comes with these boards is very powerful. You can install it quite easily on these boards as well, and there are good tutorials I can put a link to for that. But it's a very useful board and quite fun to program for. Bye.